Hello everyone. I originally posted this review earlier this year, and it's possibly one of my favorite videos I've ever done. I not only thoroughly review the unreleased Dreamcast game Propeller Arena, but discuss the historical context in which its inevitable cancellation occurred. A very big reason, in fact the main reason for its cancellation, had to do with a very tragic historical event that happened on the East Coast in the early 2000s. While you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, here's Lisa Simpson offering a slightly less cryptic reference to this event. Now that you know exactly what I'm referring to, YouTube's content police really didn't like me directly referencing this historical event, no matter how contextually appropriate and respectful I was around it. Immediately following this video going up, my channel was more or less nuked by YouTube. Almost overnight, I saw my viewership reduced by over 50%, and many of my other videos that were once towards the top of relevant search results were now buried under dozens of similar videos. At first, I didn't understand what the hell was going on, not until I did a little research and found out YouTube really hates when you discuss anything even remotely controversial on their platform. In fact, they hate it so much they will directly, or in my case, indirectly censor you in order to protect their wallets from advertiser and community backlash. And look, I get it. YouTube and their parent company Google Inc. are corporations that exist solely to make money. People who use their platform to spread hate, conspiracy theories, political extremism, and violence obviously make them look bad, which in turn impacts their bottom line. However, censoring history is a very, very dangerous road to go down, and forbidding factual discussion of historical events is not only a bad look, but it's just morally wrong. As cliche as it's become to say this, it's absolutely 100% true that those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it. But to satisfy YouTube's ridiculous content suppression, I've gone back and bleeped out every direct reference to that historical event in this video. Yes, this is silly. Yes, this is absolutely ridiculous, but I guess it's better than never allowing anyone to see this review ever again. And sadly, this still might not be enough, and I'll be forced to remove it again after YouTube buries my channel once more. I guess we'll just have to wait and see now, won't we? But anyhow, sit back and enjoy my review on the ill-fated unreleased Dreamcast game, Propeller Arena. The late 90s and early 2000s are still to this day my absolute favorite era of gaming. Not only do we have exciting new releases on older consoles like the N64, PS1, and Saturn during this time, but in 1998 or 1999 for everyone outside Japan, we experienced the 6th generation of consoles kick off with the legendary Sega Dreamcast. Full disclosure, I love the Dreamcast and have ever since I first played Power Stone on a Dreamcast kiosk at my local Hollywood Video. I mean seriously, I used to ride my bike up to Hollywood Video just to play their Dreamcast kiosk. That's just how infatuated I was with the console. Of course, I had to have my very own Dreamcast ASAP, so I coerced my little brother into asking for one for his birthday just a few months after the Dreamcast North American launch. And yeah, I did let him play his Dreamcast. I mean, sometimes. I wasn't a complete dick of an older brother after all, I mean, come on. But anyhow, I loved my Dreamcast, I mean my little brother's Dreamcast back in the late 90s and early 2000s. During this period, I played so many great games for it that are now considered classics on the console. While all this was happening, however, I was completely unaware that the Dreamcast was hanging on for dear life just months after its debut. It wasn't until after the Dreamcast was officially discontinued in early 2001 that I even learned of its demise. Part of this had to do with me still being able to buy new Dreamcast games from places like Target and Best Buy, as well as the occasional new release I'd hear about in the newest issue of GamePro magazine. In fact, the Dreamcast still saw a fairly substantial stream of games after it was officially discontinued, even including bigger titles like Project Justice, Crazy Taxi 2, and even Sonic Adventure 2 of all games. So with all this happening as late as fall of 2001, why would I have suspected anything bad was going on behind the scenes? Even after I did find out about the Dreamcast demise, I was still excited for various games I'd read about in video game magazines, and even seen ads and commercials for. Unfortunately, some of these games would never see the light of day, even though many of them were essentially complete at the time their publishers pulled the plug on their Dreamcast releases. One of the most famous examples of this was the Dreamcast port of Half-Life, which received quite a bit of press and even got a guide published specifically for that version. While Half-Life might have been the most famous unreleased Dreamcast game, there is still another more obscure title that certainly has a more interesting and also tragic reason why it never reached store shelves. Propeller Arena was an arcade-style aerial dogfighting game developed by the legendary Sega AM2 studio, which was responsible for many Sega classics like Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA, and my personal favorite, Shenmue. Slated as a first-party release, Sega had planned on releasing Propeller Arena worldwide worldwide on September 19, 2001, a whole 6 months after the company had discontinued the console it was to be released on. However, in a severe stroke of bad luck, the attacks would take place just a week prior to Propeller Arena's scheduled release, which complicated things just a little bit. However tragic and shocking the events of were, you might be wondering how they'd have any impact on a Japanese video game publisher releasing one of their games on a console they weren't even making anymore. For those of you who are either too young to remember or were born afterwards, pretty much anything having to do with planes, terrorist attacks, bombings, or was more or less unofficially banned from public consumption for a year or two after the attacks. This included everything from specific movies, music, album covers, and yes, even video games that all invoked thoughts of the attacks. Now pretend for a minute that you're Sega and you're about to release a game with cover art that looks like this, and also allows you to fly planes in close proximity to skyscrapers and other man-made structures. Yeah. Sega knew they'd be walking into a firestorm of controversy if they even thought about releasing Propeller Arena following. Combine this with the fact that the game was set to release on a dead console, and it was a no-brainer why Sega canceled this game's release. 2001 came and went, people's sensitivity towards anything that reminded them of that tragic day diminished, and eventually Supertramp albums and Die Hard can be enjoyed again. However, Propeller Arena still remains Sega's forbidden game that never got any sort of release or was really ever mentioned again. Fortunately, a little thing called the internet exists, and some wonderful soul at Sega decided to leak the full game online for people to experience for the first time. Having been leaked online for some time now, Propeller Arena has been played and enjoyed by many people at this point. Despite this, you're still unlikely to find anyone who actually knows what this game is or remembers the very limited info on it leading up to its release date that never happened. I personally found out about Propeller Arena during my feverish Dreamcast collecting phase towards the beginning of the 2010s, and even though I knew an official physical copy didn't exist, that didn't stop me from paying someone online to make me a high-quality repro copy of it, just so I could feel like I owned something truly special. But really, how special is Propeller Arena? I mean, sure, the story behind Propeller Arena and its cancellation are pretty interesting, as well as it having the feel of some forbidden game you're not even supposed to know exists. But none of that hardly matters if the game itself really isn't that great. That's what I'm here to find out and determine whether Propeller Arena's cancellation meant gamers were tragically deprived of an excellent first-party Sega gem, or if this game was better left forgotten. So strap in and let's dive into the unreleased Sega Dreamcast game that killed. As mentioned earlier, Propeller Arena is an aerial combat game that will have you taking control of one of several planes, piloted by some very quirky and over-the-top pilots. In actuality, there really are only 2 ship types to choose from, and really there should only be one, since there really isn't any difference in each plane's abilities or how each of them handles. But at least you get very different pilots between ships, which are, well, an interesting bunch. Similar to other late 90s Sega arcade games, the characters you'll be choosing from are an assortment of colorful, over-the-top caricatures that'll end up being the real reason why you choose one plane over another. Unfortunately, you'll probably regret picking any of the game's characters within the first 15 minutes of playing, though. Going along perfectly with the way each of the characters looks, they'll also be delivering their lines with a level of obnoxiousness matched only by their appearance. And it would be one thing if these lines only came up sparingly, but you'll be hearing each character deliver the same 4 or 5 phrases over and over and over and over and over again. And considering these assholes pretty much talk every time you hit an enemy or get hit, you're in for a very long ride. Luckily though, Propeller Arena's soundtrack is an improvement over its voice acting. Propeller Arena's OST feels like it was ripped straight out of Sega's late 90s chest of licensed music. In other words, you'll be listening to various punk rock songs very similar to what Crazy Taxi or Top Skater had to offer, with the exception being that musical genre actually felt appropriate for those games. Propeller Arena's visual themes and levels just don't scream punk rock to me, I'm sorry. Sega could have definitely made a much better OST for this game had they just composed it in-house, versus using the same 5 or so punk songs that not only don't fit in with this game, but really aren't that great as far as punk rock goes. But anyhow, enough about Propeller Arena's audio, let's move on to how well the game plays. Overall, Propeller Arena is a pretty simple game, maybe even too simple. Sure, arcade games are are generally not known for their depth and complexity, which is often by design. Arcade games are designed for anyone to be able to drop quarters into and figure out quickly how to play the game and how it controls. Still, there are certainly arcade games out there that may appear to be fairly simple, as is the case with many fighting games, but underneath their veneer of simplicity is often an ocean of depth and complexity. That certainly isn't the case with Propeller Arena. You'll be using the analog stick on the Dreamcast controller to control your plane, along with using the L and R button to slow down or speed your plane up respectively. Overall, these flying controls work well enough to move the plane where you want it to go, while also wrestling some very basic flight physics, which definitely contribute to the immersion of being in an aerial dogfight. To the game's credit, this is done pretty well and certainly fits into that sweet spot of being straightforward and easy to pick up, but also believable enough to make you feel like you're actually flying a plane. Unfortunately, my praise of the gameplay somewhat ends there. The only weapon equipped to each aircraft by default is an automatic machine gun with unlimited ammo that you'll be using 95% of the time to take care of your opponents. You'll do this by trying to center each enemy plane in front of you, or depending on the view you're in, inside a targeting reticle or scope. In fact, being in the first person or cockpit view makes hitting enemies significantly easier, and by virtue makes the game easier overall. The only thing you really lose by straying from the third person view is decreased spatial awareness of enemies and objects around you. Oh, and also not being able to see those sick-ass graphics on your plane. But being confined to mostly just your plane's machine gun makes the overall combat a fairly lackluster and underwhelming experience. I say mostly just your machine gun because there are technically other weapons you can use, if they're ever convenient or useful, that is. This brings me to the power-ups in Propeller Arena. In each stage, you'll see these clusters of floating red, yellow, and green crates positioned in a giant circle. Shooting one of these crates will reveal a random power-up or ability inside, and each color type has different types of items for you to use in combat. The red crates possess special one-time use weapons, the green crates have health and other ability power-ups, and then finally the yellow crates hold status effects that impact all the enemy craft for a few seconds. You might be thinking right now, oh wow, these items and abilities must really add a lot of depth and strategy to Propeller Arena. Right? It might sound like these collectible power-ups and items would contribute heavily to your ability to win each match and get the upper hand on your opponents, but unfortunately they almost never do. The biggest reason for this has to do with the placement of these items. The overwhelming majority of skirmishes in each stage won't even take place anywhere close to where these rings of items are located. Going out of your way to collect a power-up or special weapon not only conflicts with how Propeller Arena's gameplay and objectives work, but also is an ill-advised strategy that will almost guarantee your defeat. In Propeller Arena, you're going to be wanting to move around a lot, especially in some of the stages you fight in later on. Literally flying in a fixed trajectory for more than a few seconds will result in you getting picked off quickly by one of your opponents. On top of that, each stage is given a time limit of 5 minutes, where the winner is declared either by who has the most kills in that time period, or who gets to 10 kills first. Propeller Arena is all about taking out enemies as fast as possible, which means there's no time to fly halfway across the stage just so you can collect an item that makes it hard for the other pilots to fly their planes for like 3 seconds. Or in the case of special weapons, flying off to a far-off missile or bomb item that might kill one enemy plane is often done at the expense of you being able to pick off 2 or 3 enemies with your standard machine gun in that same amount of time it took you to collect and use that special weapon. And again, that's if you actually make it to the weapon or power-up item without getting picked off first. The only time that it makes any sense to collect and use these items is when the combat is relatively close to them. But otherwise, these power-ups are pretty much useless with how Propeller Arena lays them out. It would have been way better designed if the items had been scattered all over the stage as single boxes, which would make it convenient to grab at least one of them, regardless of where most of the other planes were gathered. But unfortunately, you'll be relying on the same old machine gun throughout most of your time in Propeller Arena, which gets just as boring as it sounds. Looking at the big picture of Propeller Arena's gameplay, it's definitely not terrible or overly frustrating to play this game, but rather, it's just sort of poorly designed and really makes this a wildly mediocre arcade-style game. But luckily, Propeller Arena does have more going for it in the visuals department than both its audio and its gameplay. Visually, Propeller Arena is a pretty good looking game for the time. Sure, the planes all mostly look the same, but fortunately the characters inside them all look distinct, and the attention to detail like seeing them parachute after your plane is destroyed is always fun to see. While the character models and their animations are pretty cool, the real visual standouts in Propeller Arena are definitely the stages you'll be battling in. There are 8 stages in total in Propeller Arena, most of which take place in some cool natural setting like above an active volcano or above a tropical island with a raging storm in the background. There are also stages that show off some cool architecture like this castle stage. And then of course, there's the stage that was not only the game's flagship level, but undoubtedly made Sega break out into a cold sweat on and immediately had them calling all their delivery trucks back to Sega HQ. Tower City is absolutely the game's best and most iconic level. Not only does it offer the most obstacles to contend with, but just flying around and shooting down other planes around giant buildings is just so damn cool. And while Tower City doesn't necessarily resemble any specific city littered with skyscrapers and tall buildings, the fact that it has these structures at all absolutely makes it understandable why Sega was so hesitant to release this game. And then there's the fact that you can actually crash your plane either deliberately or accidentally into the buildings themselves. Need I say more? Sega could have undoubtedly postponed Propeller Arena's release and removed Tower City entirely, but given the amount of time, effort, and money it would have taken to do this, and also the fact that Propeller Arena was to be released on a dead console anyways, it makes perfect sense why they decided just to pull the plug on this game entirely. And look, even if they did go through the effort of removing Tower City and the ability to crash your plane into any structures, the fact that Propeller Arena is a game based around shooting down planes and having them explode was just something that could not exist in a post world without immense public backlash. But here we are nearly 20 years later, and yet Propeller Arena still remains officially locked away in Sega's vault like some shameful secret they'd like everyone to forget ever existed. Sure, maybe someday Sega will include Propeller Arena as some unreleased Sega arcade gem in a compilation, or maybe a Dreamcast mini if that ever happens, but frankly, I don't think it ever will. Even if people aren't super triggered by plane crashes or flying around large buildings anymore, I just don't see the widespread appeal of a game like Propeller Arena, not just today either, but also back in 2001. Had Propeller Arena actually been released when it was supposed to back then, I'm fairly certain it would have gone mostly unnoticed, not just because it was released on a dead console, but also because the game itself isn't that great. Sure, it does have its moments, but overall it's just a fairly unremarkable, poorly designed, and boring game. I highly doubt many people today would be raving about how great it was back in the day like they do with Daytona USA or Crazy Taxi either. So unless you're a weird Sega fetishist or just someone who has a thing for unreleased video games, then I'd say you really aren't missing out on much, nor were the people in late 2001 that still had their Dreamcast connected to their TVs. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is Propeller Arena. Thanks again for watching, and please think about liking and subscribing if you enjoyed this video and want to see more Sega and arcade-related content in the future. Hell, if you have some time to burn, check out some of my other videos too. Who knows, maybe you'll see something you like. But anywho, that's all I have for now. Take care, everyone.